In May 2013, Jan Philip Braunisch, a tall, determined Swedish traveler, stepped off a canoe after a grueling 12-hour journey, arriving in the remote Colombian town of Rio Sucio. Exhausted but focused, he was nearing in on his ultimate goal, crossing the Darien Gap, one of the most dangerous areas on Earth. The Darien Gap isn't just a destination, it's an unforgiving wild place. A place where trails vanish into nothingness, where rivers surge with deadly force and relentless rain feels like torture, as if you're being waterboarded by the sky itself. Deadly animals lurk in the jungle and human threats are even deadlier. People regularly disappear here without a trace. Before pressing into the unknown, Jan stopped at a small internet cafe and sent a message to his wife. He told her how close he was to Panama and that there were many potential routes ahead. Little did he know that he would be heading into real danger. Jan Philip Braunisch wasn't your average traveler. Described as a brilliant young man, he had a deep passion for learning and a curiosity for the world around him. A dedicated math student, he was accepted into a PhD program at Cambridge University in the UK, specializing in statistics. Fluent in Chinese and on his way to mastering Arabic, French, and Spanish, Jan wasn't just a scholar, he was an adventurer at heart. At only 26 years old, his travels already took him all over the world. He'd lived and worked in Singapore, he studied in China, where he met his wife, and he solo traveled to West Africa. His approach to travel was minimalist. He packed light, walked long distances with just a map and a compass, and stayed with local families whenever he could. Jan's time in Africa showed that he was pretty fearless. He spent months traveling across Africa and shared stories on his blog. In one post, he wrote about arriving in Morocco, where a guide, who initially seemed helpful, turned aggressive, pulling at Jan's clothes at one point. One of his blog posts stands out in particular. He was warned to not get off at a stop in the town of Jorf, a place notorious for thieves, and it had a lack of accommodation. But Jan's response? Of course I got off in Jorf. If I wouldn't have, I'd never have known who was telling the truth. And this was Jan's approach. He seemed to believe in experiencing things firsthand and then making up his own mind. When he got to Jorf, he found the town to be much larger than expected, but just as he'd been told, there was no accommodation. He asked locals, who kept telling him to go to the next town, though he kept looking for a place to stay because he really wanted to stay there. Jan just kept persisting and finally found a place to stay with a local family. They took him into their house, which Jan described as a simple concrete shelter. Just bare walls, a roof, and not much in the way of warmth. It was cold at night and there weren't many blankets, but the family shared everything they had with Jan. But the way he got to travel, he also got to deeply immerse himself in local cultures. There were no buffers or tourist filters traveling this way. So what is the Darien Gap? Well, the Pan-American Highway stretches nearly uninterrupted from Alaska to Chile, except for a notorious 97-kilometer or 60-mile stretch known as the Darien Gap. There are no roads, no signs, only footpaths on unmarked trails. It's a hostile expanse of swamps, mountain jungle, and lawless terrain, and it's earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous areas on Earth. The Darien Gap spans 10,000 square miles of dense jungle, steep ravines, and treacherous river systems straddling northern Colombia and southern Panama. This area receives a staggering 13 meters of rain annually, making it one of the wettest places on Earth. Travelers have said the rain is so intense that it feels like you're being waterboarded. The terrain is really challenging. There's muddy trails in the rainy season, steep cliffs that require climbing, and rivers that can turn deadly in an instant. And flash floods and violent rapids can sweep people away without warning. Dehydration, waterborne illnesses, and fungal infections are constant dangers during the trek, which can last for days or even weeks. The wildlife here is just as deadly. The jungle is crawling, of course, with poisonous snakes, including pit vipers so lethal that one journalist said no amount of anti-venom would be enough to save us. You might as well lie down and smoke a cigarette until the lights go out. Painful fire ants, wasps, jaguars, and parasitic botflies that lay eggs under your skin only add to their torment. Doesn't that sound lovely? Even in a group, the sense of isolation is overwhelming. Visibility drops to just a few feet under the jungle canopy in spots, and every step feels like you're truly alone. The Darien Gap is also home to indigenous communities whose trails between villages form part of the route that travelers follow. While these trails offer some direction, they provide no guarantee of safety for outsiders. And for most of the people who travel through the Darien Gap, it isn't just a deadly wilderness. It's a desperate crossing. Migrants from all over the world attempt to cross the area to reach the U.S. Hundreds of thousands of people. Despite the looming dangers of narco-traffickers and guerrilla forces, hundreds risk everything every year hoping to make it to Panama. Tragically, though, hundreds of migrants vanish there every year, consumed by the jungle or taken by traffickers. For those who do make it, this is only the first step in a long and dangerous path toward a new life. But why is it so dangerous? Well, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, otherwise known as FARC, has grown into one of Latin America's most powerful insurgent forces. They fund their operations through drug trafficking, human trafficking, kidnapping, and extortion. Known for their brutal tactics and control of the remote regions, including the Darien Gap, FARC uses a difficult terrain to smuggle weapons and drugs. The area's isolation makes it the perfect breeding ground for violence. Over the years, various expeditions have attempted to cross the Darien Gap. In 1960, a group using a Land Rover left Panama in February and arrived in Colombia in June. The journey was the first recorded overland crossing of the Darien Gap, earning them recognition in the Guinness Book of World Records. And other people tried to cross it in various ways on foot, motorbikes, bicycles, and 4x4s. And for a brief period in the 1990s, a UK tour company ran organized treks across the Darien, though a former tour guide admitted it was one of the toughest jobs he ever had. Jan went to Colombia with a clear goal in mind: to walk through the infamous Darien Gap. In a blog post dated May 6, 2013, he said that he was embarking on a 3-month trip through Central America, which would include walking through at least one jungle, the Darien Gap area, during the rainy season. He acknowledged the difficulty of the route, but seemed confident in an email saying, "I can walk 50 kilometers a day if there are paths, even go swimming across rivers." But the Darien Gap is not just another hiking route, as you can probably tell by now. It's an adventurer's badge of honor. It's so treacherous that it's been called the Mount Everest for backpackers by author, journalist, and documentary filmmaker Robert Young Pelton. Pelton made his living traveling to the world's most dangerous places and said the Darien Gap was one of the most unforgiving terrains to cross. He himself took on the challenge in 2003 during a break between TV shoots. He decided to hike the Darien Gap and went with two 22-year-olds. He said the Darien Gap is one of the most rugged places. It's one of the toughest hikes there is. It's an absolute pristine jungle, but it's got some nasty sections with thorns, wasps, snakes, thieves, criminals, you name it. Everything that's bad for you is in there. But it wasn't just the environment that made the Darien deadly, he said. It was the lawlessness. The Darien Gap is an extremely dangerous place. It's used as a conduit for drugs. There's no police, no military, and the trails aren't marked. Unless you have a lot of experience in Colombia, I wouldn't suggest it.
I had 10 days in between TV shoots, and I thought, let's do it. And But in order to add to it, I wanted to experience it through other people that were at my age when I wanted to attempt it, just to see whether I'd really come any distance in terms of my experience or skills or whatever. So I traveled it with 2 young 22-year-olds.
And while hiking it, Pelton and his companions were kidnapped during the journey. They were ambushed by a paramilitary group. Pelton said they were marched sporadically through the jungle, but were treated pretty well and fed regularly. 10 days later, they were released, unharmed. Jan traveled to Colombia from the US with a plan to travel across Central America for a few months, then fly back to Sweden, where he was living at the time. And where did he get the idea to walk the Darien Gap? Well, no one really knows for sure. But in his blog, he talked about how he wasn't interested in following typical tourist trails, that he wanted something unique. And his posts also weren't really about showing off where he'd been, but more about the people that he met and the experiences that he had. As I said earlier, Jan didn't like staying in hotels and he preferred to stay with the locals whenever he could. And he would help them at their homes, fixing things for them and even helping kids with their homework. He really wanted to immerse himself in local culture. His plan was to hike through 9 countries over 3 months, starting in Colombia, passing through the Darien region, and then making his way to Mexico. Jan's gear was minimal. A few of these items were a Kindle loaded with books and papers to read, lightweight pants, a small camera, earplugs for sleeping, only 1 extra pair of underwear and a t-shirt, which he planned to wash often, insect repellent, compass, and maps. And he'd only be wearing sandals because he thought that real shoes were clumsy, heavy, and gave you sore feet. His backpack weighed a mere 5 pounds or 2 kilograms, and it was only half full. He said he could even go swimming with a pack on if he put his water-sensitive stuff in waterproof bags. Jan arrived in Bogota, Colombia on May 8th and shared his impressions of the city. He was surprised when a woman at the hotel reception warned him not to go a certain way when he left the hotel, saying that it wasn't safe. So he listened and went the other way as she suggested. But he found the streets nearly empty and something felt kind of off. But he bought some grilled meat from a street vendor and noticed the homeless people were bothering him for money on the way back. And one man followed him all the way back to the hotel. Jan asked hotel staff if the man was dangerous, expecting them to reassure him and say that no, he's fine, everything's fine, and that maybe he was overthinking it. But instead, the reality hit him pretty hard when they said that yes, he was a dangerous man, stay the heck away from him. It was a significant moment where we can see that Jan was walking a fine line between adventure and risk. He was in a place where real danger could emerge without warning, and you wonder if his instincts were strong enough to sense it as he continued. As he ventured closer to the Darien Gap, the dangers around him were only beginning to unfold. The next day, Jan arrived in the town of Marquita, which he described as cute, and wandered around chatting with the locals. He was hoping again to find somebody that he could stay with. And he hadn't brought a sleeping bag or blankets or anything, so relying on the kindness of strangers was just an integral part of his journey. Unfortunately, in this spot, no one offered him a place to stay, and he didn't want to go to a hotel. So he started walking to the next village, but just as he was leaving, he stopped at the last house, where the locals told him about a nearby hotel that cost $7 a night that he could go to. But because he didn't like hotels, he offered them $3 to sleep on his floor for the night. They agreed and even provided him with dinner of rice, egg, and deep-fried plantain, which he said was delicious. He said, "We went to bed early, around 9 p.m. They gave me a bed with a mosquito net, and I fell asleep under the deafening sound of heavy rain against the metal roof." The next morning, he was served the same meal for breakfast and offered them $6 to stay, but they refused to take it. Later, Jan traveled by bus, and he took a picture of a sign riddled with bullet holes, saying, "The fact that there are bullet holes on both sides make me think that this wasn't just somebody practicing their shooting skills." But then he went on to say that people say things are much better than before, though. There's no rebels around anymore. Jan made it to Quibdó via bus and had some breakfast along the way. While walking, he got picked up by a truck driver who offered to take him the rest of the way, even though he hadn't planned to go all the way to Quibdó. Along the route, Jan couldn't help but notice the heavy police presence, particularly when they got to an area where guerrilla activity was rumored to be. Police were then everywhere. During his stop, Jan captured an eerie and emotional moment. The host that he was staying with, Dario, was standing over the casket of his 21-year-old nephew who had been shot on the street the night before by gangsters. Dario downplayed the violence, telling Jan this happens seldomly. And Jan echoed Dario's words, saying, "This is not a bad place. People are out on the streets and even women walk around alone. No one seems afraid." While in Quibdó, Jan went to the local police station to ask for an exit stamp in his passport. He explained his plan to cross over into Panama, and he was expecting some pushback or concern or warnings. But to his surprise, the police didn't seem alarmed at all, and no one had told him that this was actually dangerous. He signed off his journal entry with a hopeful note writing, "Next time I write, I hope to be in Panama. I'm going to walk a bit along the river. Taking the boat is ridiculously expensive, about $70 from here to Rio Sucio." Jan ended up taking that long and tiring 12-hour boat ride to Rio Sucio, arriving tired and dirty, but also in good spirits. Rio Sucio was a small town on the banks of the Atrato River, and it was a jumping-off point for the Darien Gap, but it was also a known conflict zone where paramilitary and guerrilla groups maintained a presence. This was not a place for tourists, though it was common for migrants to pass through here. Jan managed to find an internet connection and sent a blog post and emails back to his wife. He was now closer than ever to achieving his dream of crossing the Darien Gap. He said, "I'm in Rio Sucio now on the Atrato River. From here, it's not far from Panama. There are supposedly quite many paths from here to Panama. We'll see how it goes." But that message would be the last anyone ever heard from the 26-year-old student. Weeks passed with no word from Jan, and at first his family wasn't too concerned. His family understood that he was traveling through really remote areas, so communication would be really difficult. But as time dragged on and they realized that Jan had actually planned to walk across the Darien Gap, their concern grew. Steve Hyde, a seasoned traveler who first visited Colombia in 1994 and has lived there for decades, believed Jan had terrible timing. In early 2013, the lower Atrato River was in turmoil. The Colombian military was launching airstrikes on FARC forces, and a truce between the rival guerrillas and a powerful drug cartel had collapsed, turning the region into an absolute war zone. The very few trails and rivers Jan planned to navigate had become hotspots for armed conflict. Human rights groups monitoring the area reported frequent gunfights, checkpoints controlled by armed groups, and the harassment and murder of locals. Criminal organizations making millions off of human trafficking had control over nearly every route through the gap. Steve said Jan unknowingly wandered straight into human trafficking territory. In one of his emails to friends, Jan wondered about smugglers, asking, "Will they cause me trouble?" Yet he never referred to armed groups or the FARC, raising questions about how much he really knew. Before Jan even set off on his trip, he reached out to a mapping expert at the University of Kansas and got detailed information about the trails that he would be using. He knew the zone was tough and physically he was prepared, but he underestimated the human risks. Steve described Jan as being a bit naive and overly self-confident. Someone who could talk himself through problems but hadn't fully grasped the severity of dangers. He added that Jan had some bad luck too. When Jan visited that police station to ask about traveling to Panama, and they told him it was safe, Steve suspected the police assumed Jan would be taking the coastal route and didn't realize that he was going through the gap. And Jan's Spanish may not have been strong enough to clarify where he was going. Steve called Jan more ninja than typical backpacker. He traveled super light, he had specialized maps, and therefore might have stood out in the jungle. He also wore sandals, which is really strange for going through the jungle. While sandals are good for draining water, drying fast, and keeping your feet cool, they offer hardly any protection from snakes, spiders, and the thorns. The locals who saw him thought he was crazy for not wearing rubber boots like most people were. With his maps, compass, and high-tech gear, Jan may have drawn some unwanted attention. Jan's wife, Shiwen, contacted Steve to help piece together what might have happened. Steve explained that Jan had watched YouTube videos on the Darien Gap, but many were misleading. They were showing tourists crossing these relatively safe areas, the coastal routes, and claiming it was the Darien Gap, but it wasn't. Once in Colombia, his course was set for high risk. Steve believed Jan had been moving way too fast and too far off the typical tourist trails, because if he had encountered other backpackers, they would have let him know how dangerous it was where he was heading, and he would have gotten a much-needed reality check about the dangers. Reports from human rights groups confirmed Jan was heading into an area filled with armed checkpoints, harassment, and murders along the very trails that he had mapped out. On that fateful morning, Jan boarded a boat down the Atrato River, likely unaware of the turmoil surrounding him. Steve said the driver would have been on high alert, watching for signs of trouble along the riverbanks. Armed groups often signaled boats by waving a red cloth, and if that signal was ignored, it would be met with a deadly burst of gunfire. The driver said that armed men stopped the boat, boarded it, and singled out the tall foreigner, leading him into the jungle. And he was never seen again. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no word from Jan. His wife tirelessly searched for him. She even visited Colombia to learn about the conflict in the region that he had ventured into. And what she learned was terrifying. Over 20,000 people disappeared during Colombia's 50-year conflict, and the area where Jan vanished had been off-limits to the state for years. Armed groups defending their illegal activities did not welcome outsiders, especially foreigners. Steve, who had been assisting Jan's family, said Colombian authorities initially thought Jan might have disappeared intentionally. They had no concrete proof that he'd been killed, but there had been rumors swirling around that he'd been killed by rebel forces. Typically, if a foreigner was kidnapped, a ransom would be demanded. However, a group had been bragging up and down the river that they killed a drug enforcement agent, until they realized that he was actually a tourist, and then they shut up. Steve and the family flooded the area with flyers, making it clear that Jan was a visitor, not a spy, and this resulted in the armed group releasing his body. 2 years after his disappearance, the remains were recovered due to the pressure put on FARC. FARC later admitted to killing him. They said they mistook Jan for a foreign spy because of his GPS device and the detailed map. The leader of the FARC unit responsible, heavily involved in drug trafficking, had been killed in a military airstrike around that same time that Jan was taken. Jan had been beaten and then shot. Jan's wife, devastated by the news, had her own struggles after his death. She was deported from Sweden, adding another layer to this tragedy. To many, Jan's journey might seem reckless, but to those who knew him, they saw it differently. He wasn't new to extreme challenges, they said. His wife explained that he was a determined and experienced traveler. But even with his experience, the Darien Gap was a different beast. Reports from local communities, including church organizations, indicated an increase in threats from armed groups during May 2013, the same time that he entered the region. Jan's story raises some powerful questions. What drives people to take on such extreme, dangerous challenges? Is it the thrill of adventure, the need to push boundaries, or something deeper? And how do we balance the spirit of the exploration with the very real need for safety? What do you think motivated Jan to take on the Darien Gap? And how do you balance risk and reward in your own adventures? And if you found this story compelling, check out my video on Emma Kelty. Her story shares some eerie similarities as she too disappeared on a dangerous jungle expedition.